All right, aloha and welcome. I am stoked you're here today. We are going to dive into what I think is an intriguing Mac malware specimen that we refer to as WINDSHIFT. Not big on introductions, but yes, I am Patrick Wardle. I am the founder of the Objective-C Foundation. We're a nonprofit organization that focuses on all things related to macOS security. So today we're going to unmask WindTape, and we're going to start with some background information. We're then going to dive into its persistence mechanism. We're going to talk about its capabilities, and then end with some generic ideas for detecting this and other Mac malware. Now, it's also worth pointing out that WindTape, though perhaps not maybe the most complex piece of malware out there, to me it really provides a great illustrative case study on how we go about analyzing malware, specifically malware that's targeting macOS. So the techniques we talk about today, the tools, the approaches, you will be able to apply to other Mac malware samples as well. So if you've never analyzed malware before, this is a great introductory topic. If you've analyzed malware but have done so more on Windows, this is great. You'll see kind of how we go about this on macOS. There'll be a lot of overlap, but some differences. And even if you do analyze malware on Apple's desktop platform, I hope you learn some new things as well. So let's dive in. As I mentioned, we'll start with some background information on WindTape. So we learned about WindTape in a presentation a few years back from a cybersecurity researcher named Taha. In his presentation titled In the Tales of the WINDSHIFT APT, he discussed, which was at the time a brand new APT group called WINDSHIFT that was involved in very targeted attacks against individuals in both the government and infrastructure in the Middle East. In his presentation, he also talked largely about kind of the APT group, their modus operandi, their infrastructure, but he did touch on some of the tools and mentioned two specific macOS capabilities. A virus called WindTape, and the sample we're going to be talking about today called WindTape. Worth pointing out that until now, WindTape has not been publicly discussed comprehensively, so this is kind of the new takeaway from this presentation. So today's talk does build on Taha's research, and the goal is today to really provide a comprehensive analysis of this threat. If you're interested in WindTape, I did give a previous talk on this at Virus Bulletin a few years ago. Also interesting and also previously discussed was some research by Unit 42 out of Palo Alto Networks. And they were more interested in talking about the timeline of the APT group, the WINDSHIFT APT group. So as we can see on the slide, this activity, this APT group, was originally uncovered in 2017. They may have been active before, I don't know, but this is when their initial activity was detected, and as we can see, it then continued for a few years thereafter. All right, so now let's get back to WindTape, and let's start by talking about its infection vector. It's always a valid question and something we always like to answer. How does malware get onto a victim's system? Taha, in his original research, noted that WindTape is actually installed by WindTape, WindTape being the APT group's first stage implant. So as we can see on the slide, right, we have a PCAP, and here we can see that the second stage malware, which is WindTape, which we're going to be talking about today, is actually downloaded, as I mentioned, by WindTape. If we reverse engineer WindTape, again, this first stage implant belonging to the WindShift APT group, we can see that it does contain logic to download a zip archive, for example, WindTape. And then we can see on the slide, it will be decompressed and then executed. Specifically, if we look at the process monitor output, we can see that they decompress it and then execute whatever's in that zip file. So again, this is how WindTape gets onto already infected systems. So we can already see that it's a second stage tool, a second stage implant. Now, whenever I'm analyzing a new piece of malware, I always like to begin with a triage. This is a good idea to give us a basic understanding of the sample, but then it will also guide the more in-depth comprehensive analysis. Also worth pointing out, if you want to play along with this at home, I've uploaded the sample to Objective-C's public Mac malware repository. So grab the sample from there. All right, so as we just mentioned, WindTape is deployed via WindTail. Specifically, it is in an application bundle named LSD. Not related to drugs, specifically named that way because macOS has a legitimate process named LSD, the Launch Services Daemon. So the attackers, the APT group, is obviously just trying to blend in, hide in plain sight. Now, the malware was originally signed, but now, unsurprisingly, the certificate has been long revoked by Apple. But worth noting, the team ID that was used to sign the WindTape malware is the same team ID used to sign the APT group's other tools. So again, this very comprehensively ties them up to the rest of the ATP group, very conclusively. Next up, when doing triage, I like to look at any embedded strings. This can reveal functionality such as capabilities, and then also continue to focus or drive continuing analysis. So we can use the strings utility. It's a built-in utility into macOS, and we can extract WindTape's embedded strings. And we can see some of the initial strings relate to persistence, likely, perhaps a host survey, and then some network capabilities. Now, it's important to note that we shouldn't jump to conclusions simply based on extracted strings, right? This should be something that we conclusively determine via continuing analysis. But again, it's worth noting that having this information can give us a sense of what this malware likely does and can focus or drive our continuing reverse engineering efforts. Now, there's other embedded strings as well, ones that perhaps indicate the malware is interested in taking screenshots. And again, we will confirm this via continued analysis. And then as we can see at the end of the slide, there appears to be some encrypted strings. We'll get to those in a second, but another tool I like to run is the class dump utility. Now, this specific malware is written in Objective-C, which means we can use a tool such as class dump to reconstruct the classes and methods of the malware. Objective-C has a lot of runtime type information. I don't know if that's the right term, but essentially has a lot of information embedded in it, even when it's compiled about the classes and methods. So a tool like class dump can actually reconstruct those. So once we reconstruct those, again, we can get some insight into the likely capabilities of the malware. So we can see a public framework that appears to relate to network reachability. We see some methods that perhaps indicate or contain the logic to do the string encryption and decryption. And then finally, we have the malware's main classes and its methods, which is where our reverse engineering efforts might begin. Now back to the encrypted strings. Any of you that are malware analysts will likely know that when you find encrypted strings in a binary, one of the first tasks is to decrypt them. And the reason for this is pretty simple, is these are the strings that the malware authors don't want us as analysts to find out. So a lot of times they have very sensitive or informative information, perhaps command and control servers or other information about the malware. Now, there's various ways to decrypt strings, not necessarily saying one is better than the other, but one approach that's proven to work, especially in samples that aren't overly complex, is as follows. So the first thing is, in the disassembly, we look for an encrypted string. The logic here is that the malware is going to likely pass that to a decryption routine so that it can decrypt it and then use the string. So that's exactly what we do. So in the disassembly, we find an encrypted string right here. We have no idea what this encrypted string is. But if we look for cross-references, we can see eventually it's passed to a method called DED. And if we look at the parameter, the argument name, we can see the second one is named key. So this likely indicates that this is the decryption function. Obviously, we take a closer look at that DED method, and we confirm that, yes, this is the decryption method. It takes an encrypted string and a decryption key, which is hard-coded in the malware, and then decrypts the encrypted string via des in CBC mode. So armed with this knowledge, we can very easily now write a decryptor for the malware. It's about 8 lines of Python, really nothing too complicated. We import the crypto libraries, and since we know the key, the initialization vector, which again is hard-coded into the malware, we can very trivially now decrypt the embedded strings. So what do the encrypted strings contain? Well, there's not a ton of them, but we can see first and foremost, we get the command and control server, string2me.com. This is great because now we know what this malware talks to. Also worth pointing out, this is the same command and control server that the WindTail malware talks to, the first stage implant. Not too surprising, same APT group, using the same command and control server. Other decrypted strings, we see paths to various utilities, including the path to the screen capture capability. Some foreboding here, but this is likely a capability of the malware. So now our triage is complete, right? We have a fairly solid understanding of what this malware likely does, and we also have the ability to decrypt its strings. So now we're going to dive a little deeper to complete the comprehensive analysis of this threat. So the first thing I like to do, or one of the first questions after I've done some triage, is figure out how the malware persists. In the context of this presentation, persistence simply means the mechanism the malware uses to install itself so that anytime the system is rebooted or the user logs in, the malware is automatically restarted. This is something that the majority of Mac malware strives to achieve, because if it didn't persist and the user rebooted the system, they would effectively clean the system. So let's discuss the persistence mechanism used by WindTape. If we execute the malware in an isolated virtual machine, we can observe some actions. Specifically, we can see it first copying itself to the user's library directory. We can then see it launch that copy. That secondary copy, which is now running, will persist itself as a login item. A login item is a mechanism that macOS provides that if you install yourself as a login item, you will be automatically re-executed every time the user re-logs in. We can confirm all of this by A, running a process monitor, see, for example, it makes that copy, and then if we set a debugger to attach to that second instance, once that second instance is spawned, we can set breakpoints on the persistence APIs and ensure and actually see that, yes, indeed, the malware is persisting. Also, macOS does provide a mechanism to see the login item, so once the malware has persisted, we can open the UI and see, yes, indeed, the malware, LSD, has persisted. So now we know how the malware persists. Let's confirm its capabilities. Recall that some of the embedded strings and the decrypted strings showed the malware seemed to have a propensity for screenshots. So let's confirm this via reverse engineering. On the screen, we have some of the disassembly. We can see the malware first uses the public reachability framework to make sure the malware can talk to google.com. This is just a way for the malware to ensure that the victim's system is indeed connected to the internet. If this returns true, meaning, yes, indeed, the victim's system is connected to the internet, the malware will schedule something to execute every 10 seconds via a timer. And if we look at the disassembly, we can see the method, the selector it calls, is something named SCP. So let's take a look at the SCP method, noting we have the disassembly on the slide. It's pretty straightforward, especially once we annotate it. We can see it first decrypts the string to the screen capture utility that's built in on macOS. It then builds a file name for the output of the screen capture it's going to execute, and then executes the screen capture utility with those parameters to capture the user's screen. Again, if we use a process monitor, we can passively observe this execution as well as the parameters that the malware passes to the screen capture utility. The screen capture is then compressed and exfiltrated to the attacker's command and control server via macOS's built-in curl utility. Again, this is spawned via the NSTask APIs. If we look at this assembly, we can find a decrypted string, encrypted string that decrypts to the command and control server string2me.com. And this is, again, the address of the command and control server where the attackers will exfiltrate the screen captures to. Via the process monitor, we can observe this exfiltration in action. Specifically, we can see that curl, built into macOS, is executed, and it's executed with the -f flag, which according to the man pages will generate a HTTP or HTTPS post request along with the data that is specified. Since we're running a process monitor, we can see the arguments that curl was executed. So very easily, we can confirm the fact that indeed the malware is exfiltrating or uploading the screen capture utility via a post request. We can also see a UUID and the name of the infected system. So there's some extra information that allows the attackers to know which exact victim system this screenshot is coming from. Now, I also want to mention another neat capability of WindTape, which is its ability to self-delete. It's not super common in macOS malware. Smart feature to have. So as we can see on the slide, every time the malware starts up, it connects to the command and control server to a specific API endpoint, basically saying, should I self-delete? If this API endpoint returns a 1, a true, the malware will do two things. It will first delete and then terminate itself. As I mentioned, this is kind of a neat feature. This allows the adversaries to kind of clean up the malware if A, they determine the target is of no value, or B, perhaps an antivirus signature comes out or it's detected on other target systems and they want to remove it without being, before the victim, figures out by perhaps deploying those signatures. All right, so we've talked about the capabilities. Let's now kind of start wrapping this up by talking about how to detect WindTape heuristically. First and foremost, if you are monitoring the file system for persistence events, it's very easy to detect malware such as WindTape when it goes to persist. So I wrote a free open source tool called BlockBlock, simply monitors the file system specifically for these persistence events. And even though it had no a priori knowledge of the malware, as soon as WindTape goes to persist itself as a login item, you can see that BlockBlock pops up and alerts the user to this fact. Specifically that WindTape, or untrusted piece of software, has just persisted. Similarly, we can utilize other heuristics to detect other behaviors or actions of the malware. So if you're monitoring network connections, for example, you have a firewall or any other ability to monitor or gain insight into network traffic, you can detect this malware pretty easily on two specific events. First and foremost, when it connects out to its command and control server, and that will be tied directly to the LSD process. Or you can also detect when curl is executed. Now, the latter, curl being executed, might not necessarily be malicious per se, right? Curl is a built-in utility into macOS. But in this case, if we look at the process hierarchy, we can see that it has been executed by an untrusted, unrecognized process, which is kind of a dead giveaway that something shady is going on. Also, it's pretty easy to reactively detect the infection of the malware because it's not trying to hide per se, basically trying to blend in. And also, its persistence mechanism is not that sophisticated or stealthy. So I wrote a tool called Knock Knock. It simply enumerates persistently installed software on your operating system. And here you can see that it is very easily uncovered the launch item. These tools are all free, open source, so if you want to try them out, hop over to objective-c.org, or if you just want to look at the source code and figure out some ideas for writing security tools for macOS. All right, so let's wrap this up with some conclusions and some takeaways. First, as I'm sure we all know, it's always wise to analyze APT groups' capabilities. We don't see a lot of APTs targeting macOS. There's maybe reasons for that. Maybe we're not looking hard enough. Maybe they're extra stealthy. Maybe there's just not that many APT groups targeting macOS. I think there are. So when we do find an APT group that has Mac capabilities, I think it's very important to comprehensively analyze them to get an understanding of how advanced adversaries are targeting this platform. Another takeaway, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the approaches, the tools, the techniques we talked about today, just want to drive home the point that these are not specific to WindTape. These can obviously be used to analyze other Mac malware specimens as well. And then finally, and this is fairly obvious as well, heuristic methods, they do have the downsides of perhaps false positives, but other than that, they can be a very powerful approach to detecting even brand new malware such as WindTape, right? We talked about monitoring for persistence or unauthorized network activities. This malware, even though it was new, was not incredibly stealthy, so heuristics could very easily flag it, again, with no a priori knowledge of the malware specifically. Now, I've enjoyed this talk. I've actually written a whole book on the topic of malware analysis, specifically Mac malware analysis. If you hop over to the book's website, taomm.org, it's fully available online for free. The idea was to create a comprehensive resource for the community. And if you want a hard copy, it is published by No Starch Press. And I will point out that all royalty payments from the book are donated back to the Objective-C Foundation. So if you buy the book, you're also supporting a great cause. And speaking of the Objective-C Foundation, I just briefly want to thank the companies and products that sponsor the research. And they allow me to be here today, publish the free tools and the book, so quick shout out and mahalo to them. I also want to thank the organizers of Virus Bulletin. It's great to be back in person and seeing all your smiling faces. And of course, all of you for attending the talk. So I have a few minutes left for Q&A, and so if there's any questions, I will take those now. You can also come up and chat with me after the talk. Again, thank you so much for attending my presentation today.
Thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. Great news, and I'm sure we have some questions over there, and we have plenty of time for questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Did you reveal how the LSD app was infecting the client?
Yes, so great question. How does LSD infect the client? So WindTape, as I mentioned kind of early on, is actually downloaded by WindTail, which is the first stage implant. If you're wondering how the first stage implant is infected, which maybe is what you're asking, they actually used a very unique trick, which was abusing custom URL schemes on macOS. So on previous versions of macOS, what you could do is you could create a website that would automatically download the application. And macOS and Apple's infinite wisdom decides to, or used to, automatically register any custom URLs that that application would handle, even though that application had never been launched or was downloaded with user approval. So now you have an app sitting on disk that has a registered custom URL. Well, what does the website then do? It makes a request to the custom URL, which triggers the execution of that. Now macOS pops up and says, hey, are you sure you want this new app to handle this custom URL request? But older versions of macOS did not, and so the application would be actually automatically executed. And the neat thing about that attack, and I talked more about that in my previous virus bulletin talk, so if you want to dive into all the technical details, check that out, is that it abused legitimate functionality of the operating system. So there's no memory corruption. It was essentially 100% reliable. So kind of neat to see adversaries abusing this legitimate feature. So that's how they gained initial code execution to install WindTail. And then WindTail would reach out and download WindTape as the second stage to capture the screenshots, kind of as a cyber espionage or intelligence operation. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. I see one more question.
The should I kill myself test, if I read it correctly, is an HTTP one, right? So it's extraordinarily trivial for defenders to monitor for and or to actually act on, right?
It's actually an HTTPS request.
Okay.
I think. Let's go back and look. That's a very
there's
great.
an error in your slide, I think, in that case.
Yeah. Oh, maybe I have a spelling mistake. It might be. I will have to check. But I agree. Or the other thing.
You don't even need to be doing packet inspection or anything.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, you could just start broadcasting this and maybe telling implants to uninfect themselves. So. I'll have to double check, but yeah, good point. If it is over HTTP, trivial to both detect the network traffic and see what it's doing. And even if it's over HTTP, probably the fact that it's talking to that command and control server. So very good observation. One other thing is I didn't see the self-delete logic that the malware removes the persistence. I'm not sure what macOS does if you delete something that was previously persisted, like does the operating system clean that up? But that's something I want to look into. I would guess it's probably an oversight on the malware, but further research pending. Any other questions? You probably have a question.
Oh yeah, but there's some more from Morten.
You can just yell. I could probably hear you from there.
So I'm not sure whether this really matters in the end, but just out of curiosity, where do you see, or how do you see malware being created? Is it mainly Swift? Is it Objective-C? Is it something else? Do you know?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And it's kind of all over the board, largely depending on where the malware authors have previous experience. So at the end of each year, I like to publish kind of a Mac Malware of the Year report, looking at all the new Mac malware. And I believe it was 2020 or 2021. Half of the Mac malware had actually originally existed on other platforms, so either Windows or Linux. So the takeaway from that, and this will answer part of your question, is that adversaries are clearly aware of the fact of the increased prevalence of macOS, especially in the context of the enterprise. They say, hey, we have Windows malware and Linux malware. We have the protocols, the command and control servers that can talk to this malware. If we can cross-platform compile it or even rewrite it to run natively on macOS, now we have all these other targets that we can support. So that's one big trend. That malware is usually written cross-platform, and so it's maybe C, C++, because C will run natively on macOS, obviously. From Linux, we see a lot of more kind of script-based, Python scripts that have been compiled into Mach-O binaries. We see a lot of malware that's now written in Go, which is kind of a pain to reverse engineer, but it's kind of a common language. And then the main two, I would say, is Objective-C. And the Objective-C malware seems to be written by the adversaries that fundamentally understand macOS the best. And we can tell this kind of by their approaches and their techniques that show that they have a fundamental understanding of the operating system and thus the programming language as well. So even if the malware is perhaps cross-platform, it has a Windows component, it's usually rewritten in Objective-C. Swift, we're seeing that as well. It's kind of annoying because Swift is a little more, in my opinion, difficult to reverse engineer than Objective-C. Objective-C is great. As we saw on the slide, you can reconstruct it very easily. It's very verbose. So unless the adversaries go in and manually obfuscate methods and class names, those are all going to still exist in the compiled binary. And so the TLDR is kind of all over. Objective-C, definitely Swift, but Go, Python, and C are all kind of contenders as well. So for better or worse, you have to be good at reverse engineering and understanding the nuances of all of those, which can be a learning experience.
Okay, great. Do we have any more questions from our audience? So,
One more.
One more?
If you had to venture to guess, how many more APTs do you think are out there that target macOS that we don't know about?
Great question. So I would say any APT group that is associated with a nation state and is interested in, I would say cyber espionage versus just ransomware type stuff, likely has capabilities. I used to work for a US government intelligence agency. I can't comment on their Mac capabilities, but suffice to say, they're obviously going to have such capability. So I would extrapolate that and say that any other nation state that is deploying exploits and Windows capabilities, it's very likely that they have similar Mac capabilities. I would say a few years ago, or maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago, if you look at the Mac malware, if you look at an APT group, they would have beautiful Windows malware, and I say that as a compliment to them, where you reverse engineer it, you're like, wow, this is very elegant, and then you look at their Mac capabilities, you're like, this looks like it was written by a 5th grader. No offense to 5th graders. And so it was kind of interesting to see this disparity, and I think it was because these APT groups had been targeting Windows for so long because that's what was running in all the enterprises, and their targets were likely running Windows-based systems or Linux, Solaris, et cetera. So likely not macOS. Now, though, if you think about it, especially in the US, most enterprises have a lot of Macs, especially in the startup space. You also think who's using the Macs in the corporations. It's usually the R&D teams, probably the C-level execs. Those are who you want to be targeting anyways. And so APT groups are obviously very cognizant of that. I don't have an exact number, but I would say any mature APT group likely has Mac capabilities that perhaps we just don't see. And there's many reasons for this. For a long time, companies, Mac users didn't think they had to run third-party security tools. You have Cupertino telling everyone that Apples don't get Macs. I mean, that's literally what they said, Macs don't get viruses on their website. So, not to blame. Now I think there's more mature security tools, and they're starting to pick up some of these APT-type activities. So I expect it just to expand. But again, long answer, the short of it would be any APT group that has decent Windows capabilities likely has some Mac capabilities, even if they're not as mature or sophisticated, in my opinion. So let's keep our eyes open.
Okay, thank you very much. We are out of time now, so if you have any further questions, feel free to ask him
I love to
at
talk
the
about
bar or at another later time. And thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you.